Welcome to On Asian America. I am your host, Kristin Leong. I'm KUOW's community engagement producer here in Seattle. Today, I am joined by Dr. Tabitha Espina, Assistant Professor of Rhetoric and Composition at Eastern Oregon University, Dr. Douglas Ishii, Assistant Professor of Asian American Literature and Culture in the Department of English at the University of Washington, and singer, composer, and violinist looper, Joe Kye. This broadcast is part of a new series presented in partnership by KUOW Public Radio, Humanities Washington, Spokane Public Radio, and Northwest Public Broadcasting. For the past few weeks, journalists, scholars, artists, and community members have come together to explore Asian and Pacific Islander identities and experiences in America today. This show is part 4 of the series, where our conversation will take a closer listen to some of the stories that have been shared so far. I hope hearing from those in the Asian and Pacific Islander communities will help listeners think deeply and grow in empathy as we explore what it means to be Asian in America today. Now, we should be clear. There is no way any one conversation can completely represent the breadth and depth of our Asian and Pacific Islander identities and experiences. My hope is that this conversation is just one of many to come. If you don't hear your story represented today, reach out. We read all of your messages, and if you do reach out, your story might become part of an upcoming show. You can email us at engage@kuow.org. Now, before we dive in, I want to address one thing. Here at KUOW, we really do read all of your messages and listen to all of your voicemails, and your thoughtful feedback guides our programming. One comment that seems to be coming in frequently is that some listeners feel that when we address race in our stories, that we are actually making people more divided. So, in response to the idea that colorblindness is somehow the solution, I wanted to share something that actress Constance Wu said in a conversation with NPR's Lulu Garcia-Navarro. Wu said, and I quote, "If you say that I don't see your race, it means that you don't see me. And actually, this is a part of myself that I'm proud of. That is not all of me, but it's part of me that I value, and I think that you should value it too." Over the next hour, I would like to encourage all of our amazing listeners and supporters to listen with an open heart and mind. Okay, time for our first piece of the day. We are going to hear from Brooklyn-based photographer Andrew Kung about his portrait series featuring Asian men. It's called The All-American. But first, a little background on this story. We passed the mic to actor Simon Tran to do this interview with Andrew Kung. I met Simon earlier this year when he wrote an essay for our Seattle Story Project about what it was like for him growing up as one of the only Asian or gay kids at his high school. For this piece, I wanted someone who had a stake in Andrew's mission to reframe Asian masculinity, not just through the lens of race, but also gender and sexuality and sexual orientation. Let's listen to part of that conversation. This is Vietnamese-American actor Simon Tran interviewing Chinese-American photographer Andrew Kung. This story was produced by me, Kristin Leong, for KUOW Public Radio. This clip opens with Simon sharing with Andrew a memory of feeling othered in middle school, where he was one of the only Asian kids in his community.
You had mentioned the physical spaces, right? So, the locker room, the classroom. I can think of a specific moment in the classroom of one of these microaggressions that you had mentioned. It was in health class, and we had to draw the human body, and because I was the smallest, they traced me because it was easier on the construction paper, and they had to draw anatomy, and they made this was in 7th grade.
Wow.
And they had him, they made those, comments and questions. I was curious if, especially being Asian men, is there a moment that you had of being othered in that physical sense?
Yeah, I think for you, it was that moment where you're kind of being traced and being almost used as a subject because of, you know, your size or whatnot. And I think for me, that experience, wow, there were many experiences like that. I think one of the first ones that come to my head is that I think even at an early age, I would hear comments like, "Oh yeah, you're really attractive for an Asian guy." And I was like, wow, you know, why can't I just be attractive on like an absolute spectrum? Why does it have to be because I'm an Asian man? Does that imply that we are emasculated, passive, weak, unattractive? You know, is that the norm in the context in why you made that statement? And I think I would hear that a lot kind of growing up and even to this day.
Totally.
That was photographer Andrew Kung being interviewed by actor Simon Tran. To listen to the full interview, which I highly recommend, and to see Andrew's portraits, head over to kuow.org/engage. Joe, I want to start with you. You have heard Andrew and Simon's conversation before because we included it in our Speakers Forum episode that you and I co-hosted together. What stood out for you listening to part of that story again?
Yeah, I mean, the first time we talked about it, I shared that my first email address was asianshortkid@hotmail.com. So I think in many ways at that age, this was sixth grade, I embraced my otherness and kind of my alienness. I also I drew a Korean flag and put it on my binder. Like that was really important to me. Yes. But regardless, you know, thinking about it now, I was performing my identity, right? So it was something that I had to address either by shutting down or being extra about it. So yeah, that's one thing that comes to mind. And then just the for an Asian guy part, that phrase specifically, hearing that you're pretty attractive for an Asian guy. I've heard so many foreign Asian guys, especially being a musician, you know, whether it's I'm playing some fiddle music and you know, after a gig, someone came up and was like, "You play real good fiddle for an Asian fella." Um, or Danny Boy is one of my favorite folk tunes of all time. There's so much beauty in that song. I think that is completely universal. And I remember singing that solo in college and having some alums tell me like, "Wow, like you're not Irish, but for an Asian guy like that, you sing a real mean Danny Boy." So it's that kind of white gaze that I'm constantly having to navigate.
Thanks, Joe. Professor Ishii, what can you tell us about the roots of this stereotype of the emasculated Asian man?
Oh, what can't I tell you? There's just so much. But in thinking about Joe's comment, right, the white gaze, here it's really important, and this is piggybacking on your experiences, right? Here we're thinking about whiteness. Here we're thinking beyond individual white people and thinking about the way that being white is simultaneously held up as an ideal as well as a norm. It's both invisible and visible all the time. So if we think about this history of the emasculation of Asian American men, we would think, for example, turn of the 20th century, Chinese American men in labor stratification, forced out of mainstream jobs and into service-related jobs, such as the Chinese launderer or the Chinese cook. And this became a way of then devaluing that labor that nonetheless everyone wanted. Sound familiar? We can also think about, for example, Filipino American men, also turn of the 20th century, in order to quote unquote protect white women, but also to enforce anti-miscegenation laws, making it illegal to marry across the color line. One way of doing this was to perpetuate images of Asian American men not being good choices. We can also think about mid-century to today, the model minority myth. One key way that this works is that there is a selective process through which highly educated, skilled laborers are brought into the US via preference. But what's one way of devaluing their great contributions? Make them seem like bad choices. So this is one history, but I feel like I really have a responsibility to lift up the work of Asian American feminists. Like as I continue listening to the clip, like very true to the speaker's experience, and I hear this twinge of like, there has been a tendency in order to combat this stereotype of Asian American emasculation to double down on the worst parts of masculinity. So I want to hold up the We Too. It's a special issue of the Journal for Asian American Studies, as well as it's published through the Asian American Writers Workshop, where Asian American leaders, thinkers, and creatives all come together under the editorial leadership of Erin Queen and Shireen Roshbanranan in order to have a conversation about sexual assault in Asian American communities that also takes up the theme of toxic masculinity. So it's not just a thing that affects Asian American men, but a thing that Asian American men also perpetuate.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Espina, I want to go to you. You're from Guam. What differences have you noticed about how masculinity is framed in Guam compared to here in the United States?
Yeah, definitely. As I'm listening to the stories and also wanting to honor the work that's been done in interrogating these attitudes towards Asian American men, I think when I consider the way that gender is conceived in Guahan, I think it's inextricable from the fact that it's a highly militarized context and how masculinity is reconceived in order to, like Professor Ishii said, maintain unfair systems of power. And so in Guahan, and as a highly militarized context in which the indigenous in particular are subjugated, I think that making them seem less strong, making them seem as if they are not as worthy of a fight. I think though that reifies those unfair power structures. Yet at the same time, that that pursuit of Western masculinity has also been used to exploit Asian American men and Pacific Islander men in the recruitment into the military. This is your duty. This is your obligation. You are not strong unless you join us in this fight. And so I think that militarization taints the ways we think about masculinity, first by positioning certain men as not as strong, and yet exploiting that desire to seem strong and be a warrior and be a provider by saying, okay, well, this is the way by which you can achieve that, by subsuming into our goals.
Thank you. For this next story, we are headed to Spokane Valley. This piece was produced by Spokane Public Radio. We're about to hear from Hannah. She's an undergraduate student and she's multiracial. Her mother is white and her father is Hawaiian and Cantonese. We're going to hear from Hannah's mother, Genevieve Haywood, about her fears for her daughter in the midst of this current surge in anti-Asian attacks. Let's take a listen. Rebecca White, Doug Nadervik, and Carrie Boyce produced this story.
Throughout my entire life, my mom has always told me that I look different, I look exotic, and that some people might abuse that or use that. I never thought I looked that different than other people. I don't see myself in the crowd. I just see me. I just am me. I mean, I love my culture and I love where I come from, but I don't ever see that as being like something that makes me different.
But the recent killings of 6 Asian women in Atlanta made her think.
All of a sudden it was like, okay, now people who are like me are getting killed. I mean, that violence, I don't think began now. I think that violence has been something that's been going on for a very long time, and now it's just in the media. And it's weird in a way to see that that's like my people. I mean, we're all people, we're all a community, so any hate towards anyone I think is our people. But like weird to know that it's now like closer to home. And it's kind of scary, but kind of sad.
This is Genevieve Haywood.
We hear the stories of parents talking about what they need to do to keep themselves safe, and talking to Hannah about what she needs to do to keep herself safe. You get your keys out before you go to your car. You always park in a place that has light. There are stories that moms tell their daughters. And for Hannah, one of the stories she has to understand is that men see her as exotic. I'm not sure if the word is trophy or triumph or what it is, that she has to know she draws extra attention and of people that could do her harm. So she has to be just a little bit more vigilant.
You're listening to On Asian America, a special broadcast. I'm your host, Kristin Leong. Professor Espina, I want to start with you. We hear Hannah tell us that her mother has warned her throughout her life that she will be seen as exotic by men. I assume here that she means men who are not Asian. As a professor of rhetoric, language is at the center of your work. what comes to mind for you when you hear the word exotic?
Definitely. When I think of the word exotic, I think of a process by which one is othered, right? And particularly exoticism in a sexualized way, the regulation and the sexualization of women's bodies. And um, as I listen to that story, I think of my own childhood. And again, growing up in a highly militarized context, a lot of my friends pursued relationships with people who were not from Guahan for the purpose of, oh, it's a way to leave. It's a way to pursue opportunities that I would not have otherwise. And yet at the same time too, I was told the very same thing: travel in groups, don't stay out at night, don't find yourself in a place where you shouldn't be. And so the responsibility was on me and
Mhm.
my other friends to keep ourselves safe, because inevitably we'll be treated a certain way. And so if we were to experience harm, it would be because of it's our own fault. And it took me years to undo that kind of thinking and to release myself from that responsibility. But I think that that doesn't come until we really interrogate what is the purpose of this exoticism. It's the sexualization and the violence against women's bodies. And once we're aware of that, what can we all do to make sure that we foster a place that isn't unsafe for women to walk to their cars, to where we can use our keys for an ignition and not put it between our fingers just in case of an attack. So yeah, I think that when I think of the word exotic, I think of another way in which women in particular are othered, and the way that power structures are reified in a relationship, romantic or otherwise.
Mhm. Professor, your students are about the same age as Hannah. Are you having conversations with them about these kinds of fears, perhaps sharing what you just shared with them about what it's like growing up afraid? Professor Espina, excuse me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, at the University of Guam, I didn't have too many conversations about this particular instance, but I do teach a women and gender studies. I did teach a women and gender studies class, and we had to really think about the differences between how we experience gender and how that may not be represented in the Western feminism of our adopted text. And so some of it did come up of, oh, well, these are my responsibilities as a female. This is the way that I am represented in mainstream media, but that may not necessarily be the case here on Guahan. And so having those conversations and that distinction of experience is important, particularly among the younger generation who find themselves contemplating justice in these situations, and who, unlike me, who grew up thinking, okay, I never really asked questions. I just saw this as the way things were. But we have a generation now who are really questioning, this doesn't have to be the way things are, and what can I do about it? So I definitely see more conversation about these experiences among my students who are the same age as Hannah. Definitely.
Thank you. Joe, you are a parent yourself to two Asian children. As a Korean American father, what are your thoughts on the messaging Hannah has been receiving from her mother about how she is seen by men?
Honestly, I'm really sad. I'm really sad right now to hear all of those things. I'll try to root it in an anecdote. One anecdote. The first one is I recently had a TikTok video in which I try to call out toxic masculinity. And so many of the men's rights people of color, as well as just toxic men, showed up on the comments feed, and one of the most common phrases I saw was "friendly fire," because I'm a man. Like, why am I criticizing men? And there's so much in that. First of all, I think it goes back to what Dr. Espina was saying about imperialism as well as the militarization, right? The fact that men are approaching this as war, friendly fire, like, who's fire? Why are you bringing guns to this? I think that that is really devastating and sad, and also I think a really important opportunity to have conversations with men earlier and earlier and earlier.
Dr. Ishii, in our previous conversation for Speakers Forum, you also brought up this idea of Asian women being considered the exotic other. Many of your University of Washington students are the same age as Hannah. And we should note, UW has a significant Asian population. Nearly 26% of the students there identify as Asian. What kinds of conversations are you having with your students about gender and Asian identity right now?
I mean, as Dr. Espina talked about, there is this sense that, number one, to be a woman, to be femme in America today is a dangerous enterprise because of the structures of patriarchy and misogyny that are so embedded in everyday life. Just like Joe is saying, we need not only to talk to our daughters, but also our sons about everyday violence and unnaturalizing this connection between masculinity and violence in everyday life. So the conversations we really have are, just like Dr. Espina was saying, what does an Asian American woman of color, Black, Indigenous, inclusive feminism look like that takes seriously that violence permeates every aspect of our daily experience, all the way down to the metaphors that we use to talk about our interpersonal relationships?
Thank you, Joe, the metaphor of war and bringing our fights to this, right?
I wish there was a fire emoji, like fire reaction, on Zoom. This is the best I can do,
Yeah. If you're listening or watching right now, we'd love to hear from you. So please share your questions and comments by emailing us at engage@kuow.org. If you are just joining us, you are listening to part 4 of On Asian America, a special broadcast. I'm your host, Kristin Leong. This final story for the hour is from Sue-Ann Ramella of Northwest Public Broadcasting. This clip opens with a picture of a Chinese woman named Polly Bemis, who is believed to have been smuggled into the US in the late 1800s. This was just 10 years before the Chinese Exclusion Act. So it was a time of deep suspicion and discrimination against Chinese immigrants in America, perhaps not unlike what we're experiencing right now. What we're going to hear are 2 very different interpretations of the merits or even the possibility of assimilation or acculturation for Asians in America. But before we listen, really quick, Professor Espina, how would you describe the difference between assimilation and acculturation?
Sure. I think initially I was trying to think about, all right, if I were to tweet this, what would it be? What would this sound like? And so I think when I think of assimilation, I think of a wholesale adoption of the dominant culture. Just throw yourself into it. If I were to take a metaphor, it would be throwing yourself into the current and just going with it. Meanwhile, acculturation, at least how it I'll preface this by saying even acculturation in the way it's used has some assimilationist and has now been reappropriated by white supremacist discourse. And so I understand that there are complications even with using the term acculturation, but in making distinction between those 2 definitions, I think of acculturation as, okay, I'm going to try to adopt the cultures of the dominant culture while still maintaining some of my cultural values and the negotiations that take place. Again, I understand the limits of that term. I understand that many don't see a distinction between assimilation and acculturation since it's still centered in dominant culture. And I do want to recognize that a lot of cultures are resisting both terms and are trying to find ways to talk about how they negotiate their cultural experience without those terms that center the dominant culture. So
great. We're going to get a chance to unpack both of those terms right now. Thank you, Professor Espina. Now let's take a listen. This clip was produced by Sue-Ann Ramella of Northwest Public Broadcasting.
Why was Polly welcomed by Euro-Americans and other Chinese not?
Well, several reasons. I mean, she was acculturated. Some people would say assimilated, but we can't use assimilated for Asian Americans because, as you know, they're considered perpetual foreigners, even today. And so we can't use the term assimilation for someone that doesn't look like the majority population. However, we can say acculturation, which is picking up the culture of the majority population, which Polly definitely did. The clothing she wore, the vegetables and things that she grew, her interactions, which you learned English. So there were so few Chinese women in Idaho at that time, although there was a lot of prejudice against Chinese men because they were seen as taking jobs from people, from Euro-American people. Polly didn't have that stigma attached to her because she wasn't taking a job from a Euro-American man. And, people would see her like as exotic, in quotes. She had novelty value.
According to Dr. Weggers, there were Chinese in Bonners Ferry and Sandpoint in northern Idaho. Many owned laundries and other small businesses, and those who were quote-unquote successful were acculturated. Some today would say they fit the model minority myth.
In Bonners Ferry, this fellow named Soo Kye, Sookee, he made an effort to become acculturated. He could speak, read, and write English, and he was married in an English-speaking ceremony to a Chinese woman. His first child was baptized in the Methodist Episcopal Church, and he passed out cigars when his son was born. The ones who did succeed and stayed made an effort to acculturate themselves to Euro-American ways, and so they fitted in.
But did they really fit in?
Okay, I would be really careful with that interpretation. Just look up Ozawa versus the United States.
That's Cornell Chang, professor of history at Rutgers University and author of Pacific Connections, The Making of the U.S.-Canadian Borderlands, winner of the Outstanding Book in History Award from the Association for Asian American Studies.
A little bit later time, the court case takes place in 1921. But literally, his lawyer's argument is like, look at him. He's a model American. He has a BA from UC Berkeley. He and his family goes to church, a Christian church. He wears Western suits. He only has Caucasian friends. He speaks English. Like, all of the evidence of acculturation, it's all there. And the 9 justices unanimously reject the argument and say that he is not eligible for citizenship because science says he is not Caucasian, and therefore he is not white. And not being white, he is ineligible to citizenship. But if you look up that court case, that will give you the perfect counterexample to any argument about, if you just, dress the right way, speak the right way, act the right way, that you would be accepted. It's just simply not true.
That story was from Northwest Public Broadcasting. To hear the full conversation, head over to kuow.org/engage. Now, Dr. Ishii, I want to start with you, but first, I have to share, when I first listened to that story, I went on a roller coaster ride of emotion, right? As biographer Priscilla Weggers was describing Polly Bemis as some sort of model immigrant, she says, quote, "The ones who did succeed and stayed made an effort to acculturate themselves to Euro-American ways, and so they fit in," unquote. My ears pricked up and I was like, that's a very provocative take coming from a scholar who is not Asian. But then, of course, we hear from Professor Chang, who comes in and he's like, hold up, let's unpack that a little bit. Let's be really careful about assuming that assimilation is always the goal for immigrants, or even that is assuming that assimilation is possible for Asians in America. So I want to tip my hat to producer Sue-Ann Ramella for presenting 2 very different perspectives in this story. So, Professor Ishii, what did you notice about the contrast in perspectives that we just heard?
So I first off want to give a shout out to Dr. Espina, right? These terms, assimilation and acculturation, are so related and yet have such different weights to them. I fall on the side of Professor Chang of, I'm very salty about these terms. So, right, my personal biography, I'm a 4th generation Japanese American. My family survived the Japanese American incarceration. I'm sorry that we lost our language because it got our family thrown into prison camps, right? So when people deploy the term acculturation, it always ends up upholding this idea of some sort of cultural purity and these really limited ideas of authenticity and what it means to be Asian. So students in my classes tend to get a little frustrated because they want to talk about like the parts of me that are American and the parts of me that are Asian, but these are all constructions, right? Because assimilation, right? Many people talk about it as an individual choice, but even as we see in this case, it's fundamentally a system of power, right? Not everyone has equal access to literally be their own authentic selves under the threat of violence, right? And one root of the model minority myth is the, William Peterson called it the Japanese American success story, written in the civil rights era as a sort of holding up of Japanese Americans, because you know what? We got put in internment camps, we came out and we didn't complain. Parentheses, not like these problem minorities who are demanding rights. And
you know, I just want to mention here for a second, we talk about Japanese internment as if that was like far away, something terrible that happened in history. My wife is part Japanese and her grandmother was interned, right? So we're talking 2 generations ago. So let's just remind folks, this is recent history that Americans were taken from their homes and put in internment camps. Yeah. Anything else, Professor Ishii, to add to that?
In general, I mean, it's also great. I just challenge us all, Asian American and not Asian American alike, to stop thinking about assimilation as these individual choices that we make, and instead think about the larger systems of power at work that make it a desirable choice, as well as to really question what we think of as quote unquote American, right? Because we're all participants in this American experiment or whatever that means. And there's a way that we constantly weight that, oh, you're a professor of English, you're the most assimilated. I mean, yeah, but like as a result of historical and contemporary power.
Oh, snap. Thank you, Professor Ishii. Joe, you and I have talked before about this idea of Asians being perpetual foreigners. You yourself immigrated here from Korea with your family when you were a child. In what ways has your thinking about assimilation or acculturation changed over time?
I mean, it just changed in the past 5 minutes, right? I mean, I guess, okay, so there are a couple articles of clothing that mean a lot to me and have represented, I think, my journey as an American person and what that means. When I first moved here, I moved to Boston. They love colonialism there. Like, that's their thing. That's their jam. Like, oh man, colonists, that's the best. And so I remember very distinctly from the first things I clung to was a Boston Red Sox hat. And that way I can avoid people's gaze and then also express that I fit in. And then I went to Yale for, we moved to Seattle, and then I went to Yale for, and I remember coming back and my friend, we were hanging out during winter vacation. I knocked on her door and Hannah stepped down and she was like, "You're wearing a pea coat."
Joe, you're the model minority in your pea coat going to Yale. That's perfect.
Right. Exactly. But she was also, I think, calling me out, right? That wasn't who I necessarily was. Fast forward, one of my favorite classes, I was an American Cultural Studies major. And George Washington, his jam, right? One of the famous outfits that we see him in is this blue coat and gold pants. And it's like, yo, that's Washington. Those were French clothes that he bought specifically for the purpose of trying to present himself as worthy of being presidency, right? That's how America understood leadership. And now after this conversation, I'm thinking about how really we just want the freedom to choose who we are and to construct our own self, whatever that means. And I think for me, that's what it means to be American. When we're talking about making an effort, when we're talking about assimilation and that road, there's only one way to express yourself, and that is by wearing a suit and learning English, et cetera, et cetera. So, and otherwise I'm subhuman. And so I think that's kind of what I was also angered by. The fact that basically you're saying there is one way to be in this country and to be appreciated, and it is not the path of liberty.
Thank you, Joe. Now, Professor Espina, you immigrated to the United States from Guam not too long ago, and you learned a few things about acculturation while attending American dinner parties. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, for sure. Professor Ishii, when you talked about pursuing English and that being seen as, oh, so you've made it. I like snaps to that. That's been my experience since moving to the States.
Mhm.
I'll often tell people, or I often still get the question, oh, where are you from? And then I have to, well,
Ah.
I'm a colonial settler of third generation Filipino from the island of Guam. And, you know, they're just like, oh, okay, so you're from Guam then. I'm like, yes, I was born and raised on Guam through generations. Through 3 generations. And then they'll say, wow, but your English is very good. And I'll
Mm.
reply, well, I hope so because I have a PhD in it. Like,
Mhm.
I would hope that it would mean that my English is good. And then I had to sit back and think, wait a minute, what are they saying it's good because I have adopted kind of the conventions of Western
Mm.
academia? Is it because this title legitimizes my experience when I think my English hasn't changed much? Sure, I've learned to read directions and follow directions, but when I think about how I communicate and my language experiences, I still very much consider myself a student of the island. And so,
Mm.
what is it that they're saying is good? What
Mm.
is it that is being valued here? And like many of us notice, it's that obedience. It's the perceived
Mm.
obedience. It's the
Mhm.
perceived acquisition of these American values. And if I can prove that I've attained that, then I am good, and I have proven myself worthy of the American enterprise. But
Submission.
when
Mhm.
yes, submission, exactly. And so when I also think though that because this is a system of power, of assimilation, acculturation, and the means by which we negotiate this, I also think that we have to recognize our agency within it and also the
Mhm.
limits and the disproportionate expressions of agency that different people have in attaining these things. So yes, I recognize that I had the privilege to come to the States to
Mm.
pursue an education in English, but don't think that it's because I'm completely rejecting the language that I learned from my home. Rather, and I take this term from my mentor at Washington State University, but he calls this subversive complicity. It's like, you know what? I
Ah.
recognize that there are unfair power structures, and because of who I am and because of historical boundaries, I have to navigate this inevitably. But don't think that I'm navigating it in order to appease you. Don't think I'm navigating this because I think that your culture is somehow better. It's because
Mm.
I have to do what I have to do to put money in the bank and food on the table. But I don't think that it's because of a submission. Rather, it's my subversiveness that I am seen as complicit when I'm actually not.
Now, Dr. Espina, listening to you as a professor of rhetoric being told that your English is really good reminded me of a board interview that you had, Joe. I want to get to that in a second, but really quick, Professor Ishii, is that a phrase that you use in your work as well? Complicit. What did you, Dr. Espina, remind us
Subversive
again?
complicity.
Yes,
Subversive
subversive
complicity.
It's not a term that I have used yet, but thank you for that, Dr. Espina.
Yeah.
Right? Because my commitment, first and foremost, is to the art and expression of number one, Asian Americans, and number two, Black, Indigenous, and people of color in this settler colony, white supremacist United States. And for
Woo!
that reason, I don't understand myself as beholden to like the traditional quote unquote knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Now, Joe, tell us about speaking some good English at a board interview. This is a great story.
Yeah, I'm on the board of an awesome organization here in Portland. It's called Bravo Youth Orchestra. It's all about music education, specifically in North Portland, which is historically a disadvantaged and underserved neighborhood within Portland. Yeah, so I was about to join the board, and I got to meet a couple of board members for an interview, and one of them just straight up, we were reading my resume, we're having a great conversation. The other board member stood up to go get some coffee, and then this guy just leaned in and was like, "Your English is so good," and it just. But
Oh.
I think, but it's common, right? I love also what Dr. Espino was saying about the multiple meanings of that. I think I've taken it as a microaggression solely for the initial level layer that because I'm Asian, because I look like this, right, that I shouldn't be able to speak English. But the additional level of you're also complementing and kind of establishing that power dynamic, as Dr. Ishii was saying. Yeah, that's
because they're in a position to evaluate your English.
right. And now that I'm on the board, I think I engage in a lot of subversive complicity, where I wear a tie or not, but I go with it, but then I do the fighting, right? I do the fighting, and I criticize and ask the questions that need to be asked.
Thanks, Joe. Back to the clip we just listened to from Northwest Public Broadcasting. Another thing I was really struck by from that segment is that we are comparing stories of Polly Bemis, who is a Chinese woman, with Takao Ozawa, who was a Japanese man. So this is who we hear Professor Chang reference in the Ozawa versus the United States of America case. Again, this was in 1922, so not long after Polly Bemis's time in the US. And as we heard in the clip, Ozawa was denied citizenship, even though he had seemingly fully embraced the dominant white culture of the time. What is pushed aside here is that Bemis and Ozawa are from two totally different countries and cultures, China and Japan. This brings me back to Hana. Remember, this is the young woman we heard from earlier. She's mixed, she's Hawaiian, Cantonese, and white. Here she is reflecting on the way many Asian cultures are often erased by being lumped together under one very broad umbrella.
I mean, I think to a lot of people in America, Asian is China, and that is all of that. And I think it's really unfair to the other cultures because there's so much diversity there. And my great-grandmother would be very offended because she was Cantonese. She was not Chinese, she was Cantonese. The part for me is that it shouldn't be lumped together because they are so different. And it's almost disrespecting the history of them because they have worked hard to be where they are. And to lump them all in one is like lumping all Americans into one. We're just all a bunch of white people. We're not. We're a bunch of different people. People are different. And when people lump them together, it can be offensive and it can be mean.
Dr. Ishii, Hana says that lumping Asian cultures together is offensive and can be mean. And indeed, the phrase, "we are not a monolith," has come to be a rallying cry for our Asian community. In what ways do you see communities or individuals being impacted by grouping so many different cultures together under one broad Asian umbrella?
Well, the first thing that I want to say is to sort of unpack, number one, Asian as the term we're given, as opposed to Asian as the term we create. So I'm very big on reminding us all of the history of the Asian American movement, where this term came from out of student organizing between predominantly Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino, Filipina, and Filipinx organizers who previously didn't see themselves in common, but understood themselves as sharing common issues. So for example, Asian American history is told in retrospect, where if we have a larger understanding of who counts as Asian American, the Takao Ozawa versus United States case is often paired with the following year in 1923, the case of the US versus Bhagat Singh Thind, an Indian American man who, according to the racial science that defined who was white, was like, hey, actually, according to your own definition, I am white and therefore eligible to citizenship, which the court said no, because despite what we said, it's white depending on the views of the common man. So this kind of back and forth of Takao Ozawa was American in every way except his appearance. Bhagat Singh Thind was white according to their own definition. And that's the way that whiteness protects itself, as this very sort of like monolithic thing.
Which is really interesting when we think about who the common man is these days, as the United States becomes increasingly more and more diverse. So interesting. Thank you for that. We are heading into the end of our show. Before we wrap, I want to give our guests a chance to share some final thoughts. Professor Espina, let's start with you.
Sure. I just want to say, Dangku nasi Zeus ma'asi, maraming salamat po, just for this opportunity to have conversation. I recognize that I speak from a place that is is very special to me, coming from the island of Guahan. So I appreciate you providing me this platform to speak of this very specific experience, and to honor the place that has come to form how I think of the world. So I appreciate that. I appreciate all of you and just learning alongside you. And as we talk about the term, I think that that's something to remember. All of the terms that we've confronted, we see the potentials, the political potential, the potential for engagement and seeing shared experiences, but we also recognize the limits. And so I think that's what I would like to leave, I guess, our listeners with, as we consider these terms, many of which were brought up today, that we consider the limits to them and how they are used in our everyday life, and the power that they can construct, but also the power that they can deconstruct if we choose to use it for that purpose.
Thank you. And Professor Ishii, what would you like to leave our listeners with?
So first of all, I'd like to thank you, KUOW, for giving me this opportunity to just be loud and say things, because I also want to assure you all, the problem is not race, the problem is racism. And the more we let it go naturalized, normalized, and invisible, the more we let it happen. So even though we're talking about structures of power, there is the potential in our everyday lives to really challenge it, talk about it, and do something about it.
Thank you. And musician Joe Kye, what would you like to share?
Well, I would like to share. No. Wow, it's been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for having me. And I think just to tag to the last conversation that we were having, even in this conversation, right? We have a Japanese American person, we have a Korean American person. Like East Asia in and of itself is overrepresented when we even talk about what it means to be Asian. So, and then we took Pacific Islanders and just lumped it all into Asian American. Like we are certainly not a monolith. And I think having these conversations and uplifting different voices, it's going to be uncomfortable for mainstream white America. But I think it's absolutely necessary to unpack and to improve ourselves as a country so that we can see the full extent of the humanity and diversity of even the categories that we've already created.
Thank you, Joe. All of that to say is I am very hopeful that this is just the start of a conversation. And the more conversations we have like this, the more we can broaden our representation.
Go, Kristin. Go do your work. Let's go.
This is my mission. And we're doing it outside of API month, y'all. So watch out. Before we leave, let's pass the mic to you, our listeners and community members. We put out a call for voice messages about what it means to be Asian in America today, and you all responded in force. That voicemail line will continue to be open through the end of June. Our hope is that today's program is just the start of a conversation, so let's keep it going. If you have thoughts about Asian identity or a story to tell about being AAPI in America, give us a call. We might feature you on an upcoming show. Remember to tell us your name and where you're calling from at the beginning. That number to call is 877-304-7190. That's 877-304-7190. Now, let's hear from a few of our community members. Here they are responding to the prompt, what does it mean to be Asian in America today?
I'm a young Asian American woman. I'm Korean, and I'm trying to enter a field where I don't get to see a lot of people like me. I think what it means to be Asian in America today is kind of the situation where you're always second-guessing yourself. I notice the joy I feel when I see people look like me, seeing journalists like me, seeing professors like me.
My name is Richard, and I live in Seattle. I am 71 years old, married with 3 daughters. I am a 4th-generation American-born Chinese. What is it like to be Asian in America? My family is afraid of going to Chinese restaurants or other Chinese gathering places for fear of an active shooter who blames us for the COVID virus. My family has had roots in America since 1869, and yet we are still treated as foreigners, like we are renters and not owners of America. My great-grandfather was a rice farmer. landed in San Francisco in 1869. My father was a cannon loader in the U.S. Army in World War II. My older brother was in the Army as an intelligence officer. Younger brother Terry was a platoon leader of 5 Army tanks. I was a medic in the Vietnam War. A bullet went through my stomach while I was giving first aid to a wounded white soldier. A white Army helicopter pilot saved my life. I am a life member of the Military Order of Purple Heart. My greatest pain has been the discovery that some of the white friends that I've known and trusted for 40 years do not genuinely think of me as being completely human as they do a white person. My Purple Heart is proof of loyalty. White skin is not proof of loyalty. I guess they are like anthropologists who want to sample our food and win our trust, but maintain emotional distance. I raised my 3 children to be loyal Americans. They care about the welfare and safety of their fellow Americans. All Americans should raise their children to care about each other. Thank you.
Those are just 2 voices of listeners sharing what it means to them to be Asian in America today. If you'd like to call and leave us a message, that voicemail line will be open through the end of June. And I want to give a chance for our panel to respond to that. Joe, let's start with you, and then we'll go Dr. Espina and then Dr. Ishii.
Whew. I mean, just listening to that last message, I don't want to strip that this person, this caller, of their own agency, but I kept hearing echoes of Ozawa, right? What we were talking about. Here are all the ways that I have done what you have declared to be proof of my patriotism, and yet, right, he still lives in fear. His family still lives in fear. Yeah, so I think we have to build something new. These approved lists of evidence are not. That's not my jam.
Dr. Espina, what about you?
As I listen, I do want to celebrate the successes, and yet even when we celebrate the successes of Asian Americans in America, it's used against us. And so it's like Joe was saying, it's like, okay, well, we need to do something else. We need to rebuild something else. And so I just ask us all to consider the costs, right? Consider the costs of our position, not just for ourselves, but intergenerationally, to be in this position that still comes at a cost. So just count the multiple losses and figure out, is what we're pursuing truly worth these costs? And if not, what can we do so that we can pursue something better and more worthwhile?
Thank you. And Professor Ishii, what about you?
So I'm a newcomer to Seattle. I just want to echo what Joe and Dr. Espina are saying. I want to celebrate that Seattle has this deep, rich Asian American history, but I also don't want to erase the fact that the majority of the Asian American community is foreign born, right? And they're fundamentally a part of our great Asian America that is over 22 million at this point, number 1. Number 2, just like Dr. Espina is saying, like, I want to be successful under my own terms as opposed to those imposed on me that are also often used to separate Asian Americans from other non-white communities, in particular to make us into some sort of wedge in this ongoing struggle for rights for all.
And I just want to say, when Asian communities or when people of color are pitted against each other, the only thing to benefit from that is white supremacy. So let's be really clear about that. Again, that voicemail line will be open through the end of June. The number to call is 877-304-7190. Remember to tell us your name and where you're calling from at the beginning. That number again is 877-304-7190. You can also send us an email. We are at engage@kuow.org. Thank you all for joining me for this special statewide broadcast of On Asian America. For more, oh yes, Joe, I see you.
I don't go to church anymore, but I feel like I went to church.
The Church of Public Radio. All are welcome.
My soul is full.
That is the nerdiest way that we could end this program. I love it. For more information about this series and to learn more about the stories you heard today, and to see Andrew Kung's amazing portraits, go to kuow.org/engage. Special thanks to Professor Tabitha Espina, Professor Douglas Ishii, and musician Joe Kye. Thanks also to KUOW's marketing and operations teams for their support. I'm Kristin Leong. I've been your host today. I'm KUOW's community engagement producer here in Seattle. This hour was written and produced by me and KUOW's Diana Opong. You can follow us on Twitter at Kristin Leong and Do Tell Media. This broadcast was made possible thanks to a collaboration between KUOW Public Radio, Humanities Washington, Spokane Public Radio, and Northwest Public Broadcasting. Thanks for listening.